And thank you for joining us here on PM Express. And in the last few weeks, we've been talking a lot about the Bank of Ghana because of the historic loss that they have on their books. But beyond that, there's also the conversation around the $250 million office complex that they're currently building in the midst of an economic crisis, right? So yesterday, the Bank of Ghana governor himself addressed a news conference. He did not only address a news conference, he went ahead after the press conference to release further and better particulars regarding that office complex that they're currently constructing. Now remember that we now have 7 days to go for him to either resign or the minority say they will begin a series of political actions, including occupying the premises of the Bank of Ghana to force him to resign. They have written to the police already, and we saw this yesterday, telling the police that they want to do this occupation of the premises of the Bank of Ghana on the 5th of September. So there's a lot to get to in terms of breaking the issues down on the back of what we learned from the Bank of Ghana just today. So stay with me as we unpack a few of these numbers and help you understand what has been happening with the central bank. And I'll get my guests in for a conversation. Okay, so what do we know so far as the issues are concerned? We know that the Bank of Ghana over the last few years have posted profits. So as you see there, in 2019, they posted a profit of 1.6 billion. And this continued really also into 2021. So these were good years. But then look at that outlier in 2022. From a profit of 1.4 billion the year before, we are now talking about a loss of 60 billion. That is actually very jaw-dropping. And that is why the conversation has been that intense. This gives you a sense of what we are talking about. From a profit of 1.4, we are now talking about 60 billion. Something really catastrophic must have happened leading to this particular problem that we are talking about, right? For you to move from a profit of 1.4 to a loss of 60 billion, it is one that has a lot of people talking. Now, that is just a basic picture. That is a basic picture. We then began to delve a bit deeper into the numbers. And then we found interesting discrepancies. And these are important discrepancies. Because remember that we got to know about the 60 billion loss in the BOG's annual reports, right? And then yesterday, there was a press briefing. So we began to just check, very basic check, the numbers that we read in the BOG annual reports. Do they tally? Do they match with the numbers that we heard from the central bank governor yesterday at the press conference? And then we began to see discrepancies. The first discrepancy we saw, and then I want to go back to the table I showed before. Look at the profits, right? Now, if you come to this particular picture here, you begin to see that the numbers aren't the same. So this part here is the numbers that have to do with the annual report. So the 1.8 billion profit you see there from the annual report. However, from the press conference yesterday, the central bank governor now gives us a different figure of 1.60 billion as profit. So what is happening there? What is accounting for this difference that we see in that particular number? They can be only one number. So we are asking those questions. And now you come to the next number, which is the next year in question, the 2020. Again, in the annual reports, we're told of profits of 1.57 billion. Yesterday, we're told of 1.5 billion. And it continues to 2021 of 1.4 billion, which is at the press conference. But if you read the annual reports, they're talking about 1.23 billion. So there is something there that needs explaining, right? And that, for me, is one of the first basic things that we saw in this particular numbers that we are beginning to look at. Then also, we come to the subject of some of the key things that had happened when it comes to the health of the economy. And when we got some explanations from the central bank governor, annual borrowing was just to meet the debt service and energy payments obligations. And these two items alone according to the Bank of Ghana governor, accounted for that significant hit that we had to take when it comes to our external reserves position. Okay? And so that again beginning to explain why we're beginning to see this huge loss on the books of the Bank of Ghana. But the Bank of Ghana, beyond that point, makes an issue that if you look at the loss that they've suffered, it is really down to two things: the economic crisis, the also preventing a total collapse of the economy. And if you read in between the lines, the Bank of Ghana was telling us that had it not been for the Bank of Ghana, we would have suffered the Sri Lankan curse, where the entire economy collapsed, essential goods could not come in because they have run out of funds to bring it in. But the Bank of Ghana has to step in, give government and finance, the government's own purchases, and that is why you saw the loss. And so they were the buffer, and they actually did this economy a great favor, and they had to step in. So that was a fundamental explanation from Ernest Addison on this matter, right? But then if you come to the Bank of Ghana's headquarters, and I want to go this, and I'll go back to that slide I showed before because it's important. And now we are talking about the office, right? The office complex that they are building, which is also a big conversation. The fundamental question that anybody criticizing the decision to build is raising is not that the Bank of Ghana does not need the office, but the question is about the prudence of spending $250 million at the time of great economic crisis. Even great is understating it. It is historic. It is the greatest crisis of a generation, something we haven't seen before for a pretty long time. So this is historic in terms of where we are. We have the DDP for the very first time. Government has failed to pay its debt, and people are taking haircuts. So is it prudent to spend this amount of money, $250 million, to build an office complex for the comfort of the BOG at this time? And then you begin to see what the BOG's own cost timelines are. And so the first thing we learn is that as of 14 January 2020, right, the BOG estimated the cost to be just around $100 million. But then you come to 29th January of that same year, when the PPA looked at it, it revised downwards to $81 million. And then you look at 6th of August that same year, and then we're seeing that amount is now $121 million. That's at the time of the award of the contract. When we signed that agreement, it was that amount, $121 million. So it moved from 81 to $121 million. And the minority have asked questions about this. Now, what is accounting for this $121 million? And they've set variations. But you will notice by now that I haven't mentioned $250 million. So where's the $250 million coming from? Because even as of 31st August 2020, when the PPA actually approved the final contract, it was still $121 million. But we've heard a lot about $250 million. So how much is it? Because this is according to the BOG just yesterday. And their upper limit figure, if we're spending anything really above what was originally thought of as of, let's say, 100 million or even 81 million, it should be $121 million, according to the BOG's own chronology, right? So that's the fundamental question. But then we began to maybe understand where this $250 million came from, right? The minority is claiming $250 million, by the way. That's their claim. When we begin to look at the cost per square meter, and then the picture then began to make sense. Because if you take 268 per $2,068 per square meter, that is what the BOD tells us that building, that office complex is costing per square meter, $2,068 per square meter. And by the way, that building, according to BOG yesterday, the total floor space is in excess of 100,000 square meters. All you need to do is to multiply this figure here by this figure here, and we got $206.8 million at least, because the 100,000 square meter is in excess. So at least the BOG's own numbers per square meter, if it's $2,068, multiplying that by 100,000 square meter should give you at least $206.8 million, right? So that then begins to raise additional questions, because I want to go back to the point that the central bank governor made yesterday in the Fed and Better particulars they shared, because their approved amount ended at $121 million. But when you do the actual multiplications based on the square meter cost, it is what I've just said, 206 million. So something must be explained, right? But the minority then adds on the variations. They have other documents that show that there have been variations that bring it to 250 million. But there is disparity there from 120 million, 121 million to 206 million to 250 million. Somewhere there must be an explanation, which is a fundamental question. But then the BOG had also argued that something that the central bank governor said that was very fascinating. I want to quote it for you. If we were to be taking the decision today, building a legacy head office would not have been a priority. That is Ernest Addison yesterday. So he agrees that the timing is wrong. But his explanation is that, well, we didn't start it today. It started in 2019 when there was no loss, as I've explained in the beginning, when we were making profit. So we didn't foresee that we will have the situation. But I beg to differ. Because if you look at the timelines here, as of 2020, this is August 31st, 2020, when the PP approved it. COVID had struck in March of that year. The economy was beginning to show signs of instability, obviously, and economic activity was slowing down. In fact, it was in March of the next year, 2021, when the site was finally handed over to the contractor to go in and start construction. My point is, as of 2021 March, when the construction site was being handed over, the economy was showing signs of instability. The signs of crisis was beckoning. The world was actually beginning to struggle because COVID was biting hard. At the Bank of Ghana, one of the things they do is to make projections, is to forecast. The world was telling us that the global economy was about to struggle, and African countries, even more vulnerable, will struggle. In fact, the finance minister was writing in the Financial Times, warning of an impending crisis. So they should have known. So when the Bank of Ghana governor makes the point that if they were taking a decision today, building a legacy head office would not have been a priority. The argument is, the evidence showed then, if the Bank of Ghana was forecasting properly, that down the line, a year down the line, we were facing a challenge. So what went into that evaluation that was done, if you reconcile that with his position on this matter? So those are a few of the things that we begin to see in this matter. And you see the revised cost there. But the Bank of Ghana argues that if you look at the per square meter of 2,068 compared to other properties on the continent, we're doing far better and saving the taxpayer a bit more. Because, say, according to the Africa Property and Construction Guide, it should be costing us anything between 2,658 per square meter or 2,720 per square meter. So they are in effect telling us that 2,068 per square meter, actually great negotiation, and we're getting value for money. So we checked that document, and then we found two things. I mean, we of course, New York is in a league of its own, so don't focus on New York, don't focus on London or Hong Kong and Dubai. Just look at the BOG itself talks about Africa. So you look at Johannesburg, and they had 1,190. That same document that the BOG referenced, right? And Ghana is there. So this is just a few of the questions that this still raises. Has it answered all the questions from yesterday? Obviously not. Are there more questions to be answered? Obviously yes. And that's why my guests come in. When we return from the break, we'll get their thoughts on what we've learned from yesterday into today on this Bank of Ghana matter. Stay with me. And PMSS is always brought to you by Cherry Tree Properties. We develop spaces as though we're going to occupy them ourselves. Syntex tanks, it is strong, it is tough. Alomo Bitters, experience greatness in every moment. Ghana AIDS Commission, also by Syntex Tank. And no matter your water needs, Syntex Tank has it all. Syntex Tank is first to introduce a double layer tank, and now you can have as many layers as you want. Syntex Tanks is first to introduce white inner layer tanks in Ghana, and we now introduce to you the customer specs order, which lets you order any color and size of preference. Just imagine just calling them and having a bespoke service when it comes to tanks, water storage tanks, and they have a 7-year warranty as well for you to consider. So whatever your water consumption, size of project or demand, just choose Syntex Tanks. You have to call them on 0244 335 168 or shop online at syntexgh.com. You're strong, you're tough. Now, I also recommend to you the Cherry Tree Properties because they build with passion. Everything for them is passion. They build as though they want to live in these houses themselves. Talk to those who have Sloane Square. It's a new gated community development at Sakumono, developed by Cherry Tree Properties. It's a one-of-a-kind, well-planned luxury you've never experienced. Call them on 0553 662 366. Cherry Tree Properties, sophistication and class. I want to bring in my guest right now, Professor Godfrey Bokwe, Professor of Finance at the University of Ghana. Seth Tekpe is the former finance minister, also join us, and Nana Utu Champo. And I want to start with Prof, because Prof was on this show, this must have been early this year, and he made a profound prediction about the central bank. He almost foresaw where we're gonna go. And Prof, I'll play that clip in which you had said on the show that the Bank of Ghana will one day be held to account. And you said that they had come together, conniving with politicians, drinking champagne and collapsing the entire financial sector. As we've seen, the consequences of those actions are coming to play. We'll get that clip just to start the conversation because you saw this coming. And I'll bring in my other guest shortly. But let me bring in Prof. Prof, when you make those pronouncements early this year, what were the foundation? What was the basis for it? And do you feel that the reality of what we are talking about today is a vindication of that position?
Thank you very much, Evans.
Russia go to war with...
Sorry, please proceed.
Our cherished viewers. Yes. So, Evans, this is not to take any glory from that. I've held the view long ago that the central bank was behind the curve in terms of what was going on. And then the Ministry of Finance was also behind the curve. So if you look at the data, it was quite clear to us that we were heading dangerously. In fact, from the third quarter of 2021, Evans, it was clear to us that the country needed to have signed up for an IMF-supported program. Then the government introduced e-levy. We assessed the e-levy as a policy instrument, right? We interrogated assumptions underlying the e-levy. We looked at it from the perspective also that if government were to be able to rake in all the revenue from e-levy, it wasn't going to solve the problem. And that the 2022 budget failed to assure investors of a fiscal sustainability pathway. Way back, early 2022, it was clear to us that going to an IMF and given the fact that we made the call so late, Evans, there was going to be a debt restructuring with a haircut. It was clear to us, and the data was very clear. We picked this also from, look, Evans, if you look at Ministry of Finance own internal debt sustainability analysis towards the end of 2019, it was very clear that we had breached a number of the debt sustainability policy dependency thresholds. So the way we were going, and then also the accommodating nature of the central bank and the lack of transparency and the denials, but really we were picking the signals in terms of all that was happening. So you could do the projections.
That's why he did that. But guess what? Former Finance Minister Seth Tekpe, who is also with us, also predicted back then, and he also was reported very widely, including our own network, warning about an impending challenge for the Bank of Ghana if it does not curtail the excessive financing of government's appetite. And Mr. Tekpe, let me bring you in here on that point and challenge you a bit with what we heard from the Bank of Ghana yesterday. The Bank of Ghana admits they did what you were telling them not to do. They were overly exposed to the government, but they had to do so to save this economy from total collapse like Sri Lanka. They had no choice, did they not? Hello, Mr. Tekwe. Please unmute for me.
Yes, can you hear me now?
I can, yes. They had no choice. Yes, you warned, but they had no choice, did they not?
There was a choice. Because I think we should put a lot of focus on the budget deficit, the bailout costs being added as footnote and excluded from the calculation of the deficit, which we have been pointing out since 2017, 2018. The depletion of ESLA, collateralization, instead of using it to pay the energy sector debt, today it is part of the domestic debt exchange. And I can go on. And we have cited this, we've written about this. But the connection with the central bank is becoming obvious. In the statement that was issued, no timing was given, but you could see in the statement that Bank of Ghana there were auction failures. Those of us who were, auction failure means BOG, Government of Ghana needs, let's, for simplicity, 100,000, it can't get 100,000, or 2 million can't get it. All it could get was, say, 1.5 million. And then BOG comes in and supports. That's what the auction failure means. It means that, it's in the statement. It's also mentioned, we did mention. In fact, in 2019, the IMF won. The IMF actually adjusted our deficits and debt numbers in Article 4 before 2020, which is why the IMF is pointing out, prior to the program, if you read the board release, that there were pre-existing gaps. And they want in the rapid credit facility, right? So the financing that was sought, we gave to the 1 billion, was equivalent of 3% of GDP. Evans, if during COVID, we have had 6 to 8 billion, 6 billion US dollars, including Bank of Ghana's $1.7 billion equivalent, IMF 1 billion. World Bank with African Development by approximately 1 billion, SDR 1 billion. How we are not downplaying COVID, but we did say that there's a gap for which COVID is being used as a reason. All these flows could have been used to make a correction. And don't forget that the Ministry of Finance or the government requested a special waiver for Ghana to treat the COVID loan as budget support. When in actual fact, the tradition has been that anytime funds come from the IMF in particular, it went to the central bank as buffer, for our forex reserves, for which reason it was the central bank that usually paid for that because that is where they got their money, right? So the bells were tolling when, in 2020, after the one in 2019, we went for that. Part of the SDR was supposed to be used for deficit financing, right? So, Evans, in short, if you keep following, or you kept following, Ministry of Finance's own budget, offsets that were being made of budget, financing. Let me pause with 2 points. For as long as you are not provisioning, you'll be making profit. For as long as you are not anticipating losses and you have to make a provision for it, right? You will be making profit. But when the losses hit you, it's same as government. When the losses hit you during crisis and the rest, then that's when all the profits you've been making become paper profits.
But can we say though? Can we say that the Bank of Ghana is very clear yesterday that they had to do this because of the economic challenges the country found itself, and they became the buffer. In fact, if they had not stepped in, would have gone the Sri Lanka way. Can we say the Bank of Ghana was reckless?
put this in. It's not the time to use tough languages that would divert. I want to focus on the facts.
No, I get it, but I know you want to focus there, but if we can't say that, then doesn't that justify their point that they were actually reasonable in what they did to save the economy?
No, that's the point I'm coming to make. The Bank of Ghana is financing the deficit. Remember, the only body, supreme body in Ghana that approves taxes, approves revenues, approves expenditure in the Appropriation Act alone is Parliament. Remember when this alert was being raised, the Speaker, through the Finance Committee, requested the Bank of Ghana, should come and explain, how the budget was being financed. You remember that long letter that was reading from the, lawyers, the banks? So the second point I was going to make is probably a separation of dependence and accountability. GRA has independence, operational independence. Policies Ministry of Finance is not supposed to interfere in the calculation of a tax, whether for the president or for anybody. Nobody can interfere with that, even when it involves the president himself.
And the Bank of Ghana? And the Bank of Ghana?
The Bank of Ghana has independence. But it's not, there is, even in the Constitution, there is a point of accountability, but it is on the reporting of the forex dealings of the states. It is not a comprehensive. So you wouldn't see in Ghana, that is where the issue is, the lacuna is, as lawyers would say. You wouldn't see the central bank. By the way, I stood for independence, right? We insisted on a 5%. It's true that some members of even then opposition, were opposed to it at Akosomo, right? But we insisted, thanks to the late Akoto Say and others, said the time will come in a depression when, even if you are doing zero financing and crisis hit, you may need a 5%. That's how come we are funding it. But to the majority at the time, it would have been zero. So what is being flouted is not just, 5%, but, but a zero, which was what the majority at the time were proposing. It was a few who joined the opposition to make it. So I'm saying that no. And the reason I'm saying that is that, let's go global. Because
before we go global, I want to bring in another two champon on this. Nana, so we've had the Bank of Ghana explanations. Of course, Professor Bokwing and Setekwe obviously believe they've seen the explanations, but it still doesn't justify what they decided to do when they overexpose themselves to the central bank. Do you buy the central bank governor's argument, what he put out yesterday, that he had to step in to save the economy, and that the loss that we've seen is not because they were incompetent, but it's down to two things: the DDEP and obviously the other technical losses that they had to take?
Yeah, I agree that losses were made, but I think all this argument is coming about because of the losses that were made. And it would have been appropriate to start with dissecting those losses.
Yeah.
Now, this 60 billion loss that was declared was principally caused by the DDEP, which formed 80% of that 60 billion. 48% was DDEP loss from that figure, and 6 billion was from normal loan losses. Put the two together, and it's 90% of that 60 billion loss that had been declared. So I think the argument of bringing all those technicalities don't help the average Ghanaian to understand what had happened. What we need to let the average Ghanaian understand is that, yes, Bank of Ghana came up in 2022 as opposed to 2019, 2020, and 2021 with a loss of 60 billion. And what is the composition of this 60 billion? And I'll re-emphasize that 80% of that 60 billion was as a result of the DDP. And the DDP, we know, was occasioned by two major events, the COVID-19 and the Russian-Ukraine war. So I think there's no gainsaying in coming up with, I predicted that Bank of Ghana was going to make a loss, and they've really made a loss. Because if DDP hadn't come in, they wouldn't have made a 60 billion loss. Look at the financial statement. They made an income of first, let's define what is profit, where your expenditure exceed your income. The income they made in that year was 5 billion. The expenditure they made was 66 billion. Deduct one from the other, and you end up with 60.8 billion. And that is a real loss. And that is where the explanation should be to the average Ghanaian, rather than going into these technicalities. And we know that this 60 billion loss, with 80% coming from the DDP, is only a technical loss. It's a loss on the books. It's not a real loss. So please, let's try and put this thing in perspective. And if we do that, we will be helping the average Ghanaian to understand what has gone on. Because in the absence of that, we just confuse people.
Prof, what do you say to that?
Well, I think that you want to look at monetary policy from a more technical perspective, and also you want to look at it in terms of, this thing just didn't happen in a single month. It's over a certain period of time, and you are looking at it that the central bank ought to be proactive, both in terms of the projections, the assumptions, and all of that. The losses we are talking about here is not just technical. There is actually a 50% haircut on principal. That is not going to be paid back. That is not going to be paid back.
But how is that a fault of the central bank?
Yeah.
Just the circumstances they found themselves in, they had to step in.
When we're talking about the impact of the DDP on the banks, we saw variations in terms of the level of exposure from one bank to the other. And we made the point that the central bank overexposed itself to the government. That is a decision of the central bank. In the wisdom of parliament, they set a limit of deficit financing to 5%. This was way abused. Okay, so we are talking about principle, we are talking about the law. We are also talking about the lack of transparency and disclosure around all this excessive financing, which is now a matter of public debate, or is now a public evidence. Remember, early part of 2022, when this issue was raised, it was denied. But it wasn't so difficult because we knew it was just a matter of time, and the truth will be out there, especially when the government, at the end of the day, made a call to the IMF on 1st July 2022. We knew it was just a matter of time, and light will be shown around all of this. And therefore, the evidence is what we are talking about today. So what we are saying is that we have worked so hard over the years in fighting for the operational independence of the central bank. And if you look at the way, the accommodating nature of the central bank, which enables fiscal slippages to go on the way we have seen, in itself doesn't help the effectiveness of the monetary policy that the central bank was doing.
I need to ask this.
In bringing inflation down to engineer growth.
You've talked about the independence of the central bank. Realistically, you expect the central bank to say to the government when they came to it, talking about the haircut that it took, 50%, etc., that I'm sorry, we can't do that. Is that a realistic proposition?
No. The point is that, look at it this way. The central bank should have seen this long ago. The central bank should have seen this coming.
And done what?
And taken steps, okay, to limit its exposure. You see, and if it gets to the point and you realize that, you know what, the pressure on me, I cannot, you step down.
When you say step down, what do you mean?
The governor. The point is that, you see, we can justify this and explain this, but we are setting the precedence. We are setting the precedence. And then also, if you look at the level of losses that the central bank has taken, the implication for the moral authority of the central bank and how stakeholders will view the central bank, I think we could have done better to limit that exposure.
Let me ask a simple question. Do you, however, concede that their intervention, no matter how ill-conceived it was, or they possibly been failed, as you've suggested, to forecast and take preemptive measures, however, saved the economy from complete collapse? Do you accept that at all?
We had options from the fiscal side. Evans, it wasn't as though we had no other option except this. We had said this long ago that we needed the fiscal side to respond appropriately. So for the central bank to have stepped in the way they did, yes, we can explain that, of course. Probably if they hadn't done that, there would have been full-blown economic crisis and all of that. But you see, the extent to which the central bank exposed itself raises serious questions. And I think that we will probably need some independent body to investigate all of this and make proposals and reforms going forward, right? It's very, very important because you see, as a lender of last resort, you don't render it to this extent. The leadership of the central bank had that obligation to preserve that. And I think that wasn't done.
I want to bring in Setekpe into this. Setekpe, on that same point, the central bank also said something that was interesting, and it has to do with your tenure as a finance minister. It says, you'll recall that in 2027 and 2018, the Bank of Ghana incurred similar negative equity from the impairment of legacy liquidity support loans granted in 2015 and 2016 to insolvent banks. In fact, it goes on to say that as far as losses are concerned, this isn't the only time they've incurred a loss. That they've also incurred losses at the time that you were finance minister. So in other words, this isn't new. It isn't actually something that is out of the ordinary. Sorry, please unmute. I can't hear you. Sorry, please unmute.
It's not new, but there's a difference. When the gaps occurred as a result of doom so, when the gaps because of lack of supply of gas from Nigeria, because of single supply, we took a fiscal decision, ESLA, right? And we started paying down that debt. It is because Bank of Ghana had to pay that ESLA debt because the Ministry of Finance collateralized that debt. It's not new. It's because Ministry of Finance collateralized that debt. As we speak, ESLA has brought in 33 billion Ghana cedis because it has been extended beyond the 3 to 5 years. Are we to excuse Bank of Ghana for that as well? Or should we put the blame squarely, Ministry of Finance, for collateralizing it? And not if you collateralize, you get a lump sum of money. Why was a lump sum of money not used to pay the IPPs? Why was a lump like we did to VRA? We didn't rush to Bank of Ghana. But remember, we were under a fund program too. And we were compelled to take these measures because we had to observe zero financing. Right? Now, let me explain. If I sound technical, this is the point, Nana. Right? You have, let's say you have a joint account with your wife. Right? You have a joint account with your wife. Not knowing to your wife, you have been going around in the back and be depleting those monies from the bank. When you're telling your wife, oh, everything is okay, and then you show the wife your statement, and then, expenditures which you may have incurred, you put them in a footnote, they say this one, will be paid later on. You do an offset, and you say this one will be paid later on. Only for the household to wake up one day to realize that there was no money in the bank to pay the school fees. This is the point we are making. If you apply it to households. So if I may simplify it, this is the point we are making. We are saying that the whole nation built up reserves. Because remember that the reserves also were depleted. Both CD reserves and foreign reserves. Right? Even if it is justified that you are going to take that money, we are saying there is a body above all of us, just as we went to Parliament. Because it is Parliament that approves. And you should have gone to Parliament with a supplementary budget to say that, given this crisis, we need so much from Bank of Ghana because the law says it's 5%. Remember, the governor declared his own emergency, right? So we shouldn't be making this comparison with other governments and things like that. Yes, it's important because it's a teaching point for us. That's how we said that the ESNA would go off in 3 to 5 years, and it wasn't used for the purpose. Now, the point I was making is that, the point I wanted to make is that these issues came out. Remember, we were debating that our expenditures were too high. We were using all the revenue we had to pay compensation and interest. This was debate which Ghanaians were having on a daily basis. And therefore, the rest of the budget was being financed, with loans, borrowing and the rest. And we're being told, we were not told that in addition to that, Bank of Ghana was depleting its reserves. This is the point I'm making until now. And even when it comes out in IMF and the rest. So I hope I'm simplifying the issue. And the point I'm making is that if you want to exceed the budget, it is only Parliament. That's why you have to go for a supplementary budget. And remember that when we talk about the budget, it's not only revenue coming in, it's not only expenditure going out. If the expenditure exceeds the revenue, which we call the deficit, the way you are going to finance it is shown in the financing part of the budget. And Bank of Ghana is there. The extent to which Bank of Ghana can finance that budget is there.
So you also agree that the Bank of Ghana violated these procedures for reporting and also dealing with it?
Because the law is saying that Bank of Ghana can also exceed 5%. And so if it was necessary to exceed that 5% and to show that you needed so much your resources, you should go back to Parliament. That's what the law says.
Let me quickly bring Nana on that because we just have a few minutes. I need to get his thoughts on it. What do you say to that point? Because that point is essential, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes.
There's a reason why we have procedures.
But I defer to Lord Denning, the Master of the Rolls, who said it's the exception that proves the rule. And this was an exception in that the zero financing had exception clauses in there. That if you are faced with an emergency that we faced with COVID-19 and the Russia-Ukraine war, then you had no alternative but to apply for that exception. Now, Bank of Ghana doesn't report directly to Parliament. They report through Ministry of Finance. So if there's anything that went awry, then it will be rather Ministry of Finance, but not Bank of Ghana.
That is actually not accurate if you read the amended act. The amended act said the Bank of Ghana governor must report to the Finance Minister and to Parliament.
Parliament, yes. So first, Finance Minister.
Yes.
The Finance Minister.
So why didn't they report after they done to the Finance Minister to Parliament?
Well, once they do to the Finance Minister, I presume that the Finance Minister has the obligation to report to Parliament.
But the law is the law. The law says report to Finance Minister and to Parliament. So they missed that point.
Yes, but Evans.
Yes.
I want to quote from a Bank for International Settlement document called Bulletin number 68, and here they quote from page 1, page 2, which says that when central banks increase interest rates to curb inflation, their net interest income declines, since a large portion of their liabilities is linked to policy rate. So when Professor Bobkin said that the government or the central bank have alternatives, this was one of the alternatives available to them. It wasn't the only one that he predicted, but there were other alternatives. As we say, there are many ways in killing a cat. And therefore, the one alternative was to go that route. So these laws that they have declared, I think it's undisputed that the bulk, 80 or call it 90% of that laws was uncontrollable. And therefore, how do we blame you when you face an uncontrollable situation, which they face? If it's controllable, then you can blame them for not controlling. But if it's uncontrollable, 80% of DDP. DDP was not initiated by Bank of Ghana. It was initiated by the Ministry of Finance. And if 80% of your loss is attributable to this DDP, then why should the blame be on Bank of Ghana? I'm not defending them because I don't work there or I don't consult for them. But I think the facts on the 130 page document of their financial report is clear at page 18, where the profit and loss account is there.
And because of time, as you say, why should you blame them?
Yes.
At the same time where we're having all these challenges, then they decide to spend $250 million on a building. That clearly comes back to the concern that the Bank of Ghana itself was not being prudent.
Evans, I think the governor, after issuing that statement on the law situation, issued another statement on the history of this that. 250 million. True. And it goes back 3 years. So it's not the current year.
Except that, Nana. Yes, it goes back 3 years. But the time that they will hand over the site to the contractor to build, it was in March of 2021, at the height of COVID, when the entire world was bracing for an economic crisis, and everybody was warning us that we're going to face these headwinds. And yet, Bank of Ghana should be projecting. Should have known that there's no way you should be spending that kind of money at that time.
Well, they should have, but then, I mean, as a human institution, they admit that, yes, mistakes can be made. But in this instance, I think they explained that because the commitment was made way back 3 years ago, there was no way they could have stopped it at that time. And the governor said clearly that if it had been done in 2022, when they faced this 60 billion loss, then it would have been a misplaced priority for them to have embarked on it. So I think we have to give them the benefit of the doubt.
And I need to wrap up on here, but Prof, I have just 30 seconds. You've heard the point that he's made, that you really can't blame them if you look at the numbers. So what should happen now?
I think that, if you look at the connection between the central bank and Ministry of Finance and government, right, it tells you that this is something that perhaps they were conscious about. They knew what they were doing. The lack of disclosure and transparency around it and all of that. So I think it doesn't bode well for building institutions. And it's
what should happen? What do you recommend should happen now?
I'm thinking that there should be an independent body to look at all of this and make recommendations.
Okay.
Because what we are talking about here goes beyond just one regime, even though you can see exceptions between the two main political parties, so that we can learn from this, right? So that as a country we are guided, and then we take the issue, our allegiance and all those things may not be able to solve all of these things, but we need to look at things objectively.
Thank you very much, Prof. Thank you, Setekwe, and thank you also, Nana, to Champon. Enjoy the rest of your evening.